And this is a reading that I'm going to put in the description. I recommend you take a look at it. Let's just briefly speak a little bit about the saint, that forgotten saint. In patristic theology, for example, St. John Chrysostom, it often surprises people to learn that it's typical to interpret Genesis 3 through 14 through 19, chapter 3, verse 14 through 19, as a kind of curse uttered by God. First, God responds to the free-willed action by punishing the ancient serpent. Of course, for John, he knew that that was the serpent from the book of Revelation. And then the woman, and then the man. And the curse is tied to the way that they've sinned against God's plan for them. But it's also a kind of sentence or designation for someone like John and the other patristics. In our catechism class, which I maybe can link below, we talk more in depth about that particular aspect of this. Today we have a virtually unknown Catholic saint, Saint Phoebe, and Phoebe means radiant or shining. It's a Roman or Latin name. In some ways, Saint Phoebe would have been a little like a first-century version of Mother Teresa, if you would have been able to time travel back and look at her. I'm sure she seems to have always been implied that she was looking after the poorest that are in the most need in the Christian community, and probably at the community at large. But she wasn't a religious. She didn't seem to take a special vow to live with them, like Mother Teresa wanted to be as poor as them and suffer the things that they suffered from their not having any money. And this isn't the situation with Phoebe. This is one reason why Paul, having specifically written a letter of recommendation for St. Phoebe, so that the other churches, the other assemblies of God, mostly house churches, and their communities would recognize her ministry, and they would provide her with whatever she needs. That's what Paul asks. Paul also called her a deacon or a diakonos of the church, which seems to suggest a connection with 1 Timothy 3:11's mention of qualifications for women whom the community puts forward for the ministry of deacon. And just like in Acts chapter 6, there were many people who would have looked for prominent men and women who had property and had done a good job in their community to help judge how the community's resources could be used and apportioned to help further the gospel. So if we're going on that route, that's probably how Phoebe got that vocation. Certainly for the patristic fathers, this connection was evident, and Phoebe was seen as the proto-model for the ministry of deaconess in the Christian East, in the same way that St. Stephen was the proto-model for the male deacons. For many moderns today, it's really, really difficult, commenting on our first reading, to see that connection between abortion for convenience. And we have a convenience culture of abortion. We shouldn't think that we're going to talk about global warming and talk about migrants and all these things that kind of appeal to people almost at an emotional or intuitive level, and not care about the clinical precision by which we are destroying that which God treasures most. So that's just the connection that occurred to me, the connection between human sacrifice in the Old Testament in order to obtain convenient agricultural blessings, or convenient military blessings, or convenient advancement of your life, and this clinical, precise way in which we unfortunately think we're helping women, and we're not. We're not helping them by giving them the ability to kill their own children and offspring. But we didn't get here overnight. It's actually the culmination of many, many decades of gradually turning away from God's plan of life and love. Sometimes that relationship is compared to a marriage between God and his people, and that's the best image for it, a marriage. And also between men and women. Unfortunately, we have so many aspects of our relationship that are off kilter, and we're putting people in extremely dangerous and volatile situations, including pregnant women. St. Paul's letter of recommendation is so exciting because it calls St. Phoebe both a deacon or a minister serving the church in an official capacity, and also a patroness. And in the original language, that is kind of a funny word, like prostasis, but the meaning here is that she contributed wealth to the church. So a patron would be someone that helped build the aqueducts of Rome, for instance, by patronizing, by giving resources and helping make possible the work of others. So she contributed the wealth of her prayers to help protect and guard Paul as he went about a very dangerous preaching and missionary global apostolate all the way to the ends of their known world. She also no doubt possessed a business and perhaps had inherited something from a husband or a father. Many women in that time would have gotten the ability to live an independent life like Paul assumes that she's living through an inheritance, especially if they were widows. That would have been more likely. So sometimes she's thought to be the courier. So Paul used other ministers to take his divinely appointed letters, some of them divinely appointed, to other churches, and usually Phoebe is thought of as that courier. That really depends on whether Romans 16 is a later addition to the letter that was perhaps taken from some of Paul's other works and combined into Romans thematically. But either way, Paul wrote this letter of recommendation. Remember, in 2 Corinthians, Paul talks about how he doesn't need letters of recommendation. That doesn't mean that he won't write letters of recommendation to help people. Regardless of if there is a direct transmission of tradition between St. Phoebe and the patristic deaconesses, yeah, talk about controversy there, because many Catholics, including myself when I began this project, will naturally assume that if it happened in the apostolic time frame, it must have traditionally carried on into the 1st century, the 2nd century, the 3rd century, the 5th century, etc. But what we're seeing is that there's actually an element of continuity and also an element of change. So that has to be understood as we look at St. Phoebe and also patristic deaconesses from the 300s and the 400s AD, like St. Olympia. Either way, this amazing woman, as I said, an official leader, but also a humble servant, kind of like Mother Teresa, a deep, deep friend of Paul, is a model for being compassionate toward others, being docile, being meek, being like Christ, being a thoughtful and really a servant, truly a servant of God's church, but also a wise advisor and a preacher of God's timeless wisdom. So today I've asked for St. Phoebe to again help protect and patronize us with her prayers, so that modern women can realize the true power that can come to them is going to come through living their own identity. I know many people think that if they just have copies, if they copy the things that they see in usually men who are powerful, if they try to copy that, they think that they're empowering themselves. But the truth is, there's, for example, no reason for a woman to want to have a harem or to have all these different promiscuous liaisons. It's not to her benefit, and it doesn't give them that biological sense of biological chemical reward. So they need to realize that, and they really need to realize that we can emulate those like St. Phoebe and Mary, not take up these bad role models from broken patterns, from broken men that we have maybe envy or desire to have what they have. God says not to envy the wicked in the Old Testament. So may Mary, the mother of our Lord Jesus Christ, the mother of God, and the new Eve, pray together with Saint Phoebe and intercede in the heavenly liturgy to help today's people recognize that true greatness comes from our personal identity and from giving ourselves in a relationship of love to other persons, just as Christ did. Free us from the coming reckoning, from that curse that hangs ready over us because of our indifference to the cries of the unborn, to the cries of the refugee, to the cries of those dying in war. Save us, beginning with the women of the whole world, from abortion, widespread promiscuity, and this materialistic cycle of addiction.